April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above France. The sun carved jagged shadows through the canopies of Luftwaffe fighters circling high above the countryside. Below them, climbing slowly, almost painfully, was the newest American mystery. Oberleutnant Hans-Jürgen Kruger adjusted his oxygen mask and squinted through the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190A5. A smirk crept across his face. Die fliegenden Milchflaschen, he chuckled into the radio, flying milk bottles. 16 P-47 Thunderbolts from the 4th Fighter Group were making their combat debut over occupied Europe. And to the seasoned German pilots of Jagdgeschwader II, they looked ridiculous, barrel-chested beasts puffed with metal, grinding their way upwards with wings that looked too small for their swollen frames. "They fly like beer barrels," muttered his wingman, pulling into line behind him. "Too fat to fight, too slow to matter." The Germans had reason to be confident. For years they had ruled these skies. From the burning plains of Russia to the chalk cliffs of Dover, the Luftwaffe had gone head-to-head with the best, Spitfires, Hurricanes, even Yaks, and survived. The Thunderbolt looked like no threat, but what Kruger and his squadron didn't yet know, couldn't possibly know, was that beneath the awkward frame of this American monstrosity was the beginning of their doom. Inside each P-47's broad wings were 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, over 3,400 rounds of ammunition, and a secret the Luftwaffe wasn't ready for: a dive speed so brutal, a structural toughness so absurd, that within 18 months these flying refrigerators would become the most feared fighters in the European theater. But back in that spring sky, none of that mattered. Not yet. Down below, Major Donald Blakesley of the 335 Fighter Squadron checked his gauges. His men, many on their first mission, held formation tight. They had trained hard, but the P-47 was still a beast they barely understood. Just weeks earlier, Blakesley had been flying sleek RAF Spitfires with the Eagle Squadron. Now he was in command of this 7-ton juggernaut, fighting with an airplane the British scoffed at. Even their allies joked about it. The P-47's best maneuver, one RAF pilot had said, "Get out and run around the cockpit." But Blakesley had seen the reports. He'd read the specs. He knew something the Luftwaffe didn't. If the Thunderbolt could survive its first battles, if his men could adapt their tactics, the skies over Europe would never be the same again. That morning over France, the Luftwaffe would fire first, but they wouldn't laugh for long. The first dogfights were, by every measurable standard, a disaster. Within weeks of their debut, American fighter squadrons flying the P-47C Thunderbolt were bleeding aircraft over the skies of France and Belgium. The Luftwaffe's top aces, men like Joseph Pips Priller, veterans of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, were carving through Thunderbolt formations like hawks in a chicken coop. In the opening month alone, 14 Thunderbolts were shot down for just 3 confirmed kills. The Luftwaffe pilots weren't just winning, they were mocking. "They turn like trains and climb like cows," Priller reported after a mission. An American pilot could hold a tea party in that cockpit. British observers, watching from the sidelines in their nimble Spitfires, weren't impressed either. "Their best defense," one RAF captain smirked, "is to duck under the dashboard." And the Germans? They gave the Thunderbolt a nickname: Die fliegende Zielscheibe, the flying target. But the jokes masked a subtle growing concern, because when the P-47 did hit something, it mattered. Even in those chaotic early missions, something strange kept happening. Thunderbolts were returning to base riddled with holes, trailing smoke, leaking oil, and still flying. One aircraft limped home with 21 cannon holes, over 100 machine gun strikes, and the rudder nearly torn off. The pilot, dazed but alive, climbed out and collapsed on the tarmac. Mechanics circled the aircraft in stunned silence. "That thing should have fallen out of the sky 10 minutes ago," one ground crewman whispered. The Luftwaffe had never seen anything like it. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, masterpieces of lightweight engineering, were agile, elegant, and deadly. But they were also fragile. One cannon shell could tear a German fighter in half. The Thunderbolt, it was a sledgehammer, not a scalpel. And inside its cockpit were young American farm boys, oil workers, Ivy League dropouts, green, untested, but backed by an industrial machine unlike anything the Axis had imagined. Still, the early lessons were brutal. American pilots tried to dogfight like the RAF. They turned with the 190s, climbed after the 109s, fought like they were flying Spitfires, and the Luftwaffe, seasoned by 4 years of war, punished every mistake. But a shift was coming, not in the air, but in the mindset. Because back in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a commander named Hubert "Hub" Zemke was quietly tearing up the playbook. He had seen enough. Too many funerals, too many wrecked aircraft, and too many pilots trying to turn a bulldozer into a ballet dancer. So Zemke began rewriting the Thunderbolt story, starting with one hard truth. The P-47 can't fight like the Germans, so we won't. From now on, we fight like Americans. By summer 1943, something began to shift in the skies over Europe. The P-47s were still bulky, still heavy, still struggling to keep pace in tight-turning fights. But in the hands of Hub Zemke, the Thunderbolt was about to become something far more dangerous. Not a dogfighter, but a predator. At 30,000 feet, Zemke saw what others missed. The Luftwaffe didn't own the skies up there. Their BMW radial engines and superchargers choked on thin air. Their fighters couldn't climb fast enough to catch a well-positioned American squadron cruising in the stratosphere. But the Thunderbolt, with its Pratt and Whitney R2800 and turbo supercharger, it still had room to climb and room to run. Zemke began drilling his pilots in new tactics. No more turn fights, no more chasing the enemy down into the valleys. This wasn't the Battle of Britain. It was a new kind of war. And so the Thunderbolt doctrine was born. Boom and zoom. The logic was simple, brutal, and effective. Climb higher than the enemy. Dive at 500+ miles per hour. Let the 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns speak. Pull out. Climb. Repeat. It was a rhythm of destruction, and it fit the Thunderbolt perfectly. Each P-47 carried 3,400 rounds of ammunition, more than enough for 30 seconds of sustained fire. That may not sound like much, but in air combat, 2 seconds is the difference between a hit and a kill. One pass, one burst, one plane shredded into flaming metal. The Luftwaffe wasn't laughing anymore. German pilots began to encounter a new kind of enemy, a silent killer that dove from above like a meteor, sprayed the air with fire, and vanished into the clouds before they could even react. "We could not catch them," one JG-26 survivor later said. "They came like thunder. And when they fired, planes disintegrated." It was more than tactics. It was psychology. The Thunderbolt wasn't just hurting the Luftwaffe, it was intimidating them. Pilots began refusing to engage Thunderbolts head-on. The German command issued new directives. Avoid high-altitude pursuit. Do not engage Thunderbolts unless advantage is clear. But the skies were getting more crowded. The US was shipping hundreds of P-47s to England every month. Fighter groups like the 56th, 78th, and 4th began racking up victories. American gunners got bolder. German losses ticked upward. In the mess halls of German airfields, the jokes about flying milk bottles stopped. The P-47 had gone from comic relief to executioner. And on June 26, 1943, over the skies of Le Touquet, France, the Luftwaffe would learn just how deadly one Thunderbolt could be. By mid-1943, the early days of the P-47's combat debut had exposed its glaring weaknesses. It couldn't outturn the nimble Focke-Wulfs. It couldn't climb with the Messerschmitts. Luftwaffe pilots scoffed, confident the bulky American could be easily outmaneuvered and shot down. But American pilots and commanders soon discovered something German fighters had underestimated. The P-47's massive power and firepower could be turned into a lethal advantage. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, learned the hard way that traditional dogfighting tactics were suicidal in the Thunderbolt. His solution? Forget turning battles, forget climbing duels. Instead, he emphasized boom and zoom tactics, climbing high, diving at breakneck speeds, unleashing a brutal burst of fire, then zooming away before the enemy could react. This tactic exploited the P-47's best qualities, its sturdy airframe, which could absorb punishment that would cripple any other fighter, its powerful Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engine, which pushed the plane to speeds no German fighter could match in a dive, and its devastating 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns capable of shredding enemy planes in seconds. The Thunderbolt wasn't a graceful ballet dancer in the sky, it was a freight train. It was heavier, less agile, but faster when it counted, and packing more firepower than any other fighter of its time. American pilots trained themselves to use this. They would climb to altitudes of 30,000 feet or more, above the effective operational ceiling of most Luftwaffe fighters, then dive down at speeds over 550 miles per hour, catching the Germans by surprise. German pilots who survived these encounters described facing a wall of lead as the P-47s opened fire. Entire formations of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were shredded in seconds, their crews left with no chance to fight back. Even the Luftwaffe's ace pilots started to respect and fear the Thunderbolt. One pilot said, "You don't fight the P-47 with finesse, you fight it with respect, or not at all." The transformation of the P-47 from clumsy underdog to airborne juggernaut was complete. And this was only the beginning. By late 1943, the reputation of the P-47 Thunderbolt had undergone a dramatic transformation. Once mocked by Luftwaffe pilots as flying milk bottles and fat targets, the Thunderbolt had become a symbol of American air superiority over Europe. The German ace Hedman Galland, younger brother of the legendary Adolf Galland, admitted in his after-action reports that the P-47's sheer durability, firepower, and speed were unlike anything the Luftwaffe had ever faced. This wasn't just a victory for American engineering. It was a triumph of industrial logic over tactical brilliance. While German pilots relied on decades of combat experience and maneuverability, American forces combined quantity with quality, mass production of tough, powerful aircraft flown by determined, well-trained pilots. The P-47's ability to absorb incredible damage and still bring its pilot home shattered German morale and forced a rethink of air combat tactics. It wasn't just a fighter anymore. It became a flying fortress capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory and delivering devastating ground attacks. Pilots like Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, who survived near-impossible damage in his Thunderbolt, became legends, proof that the P-47 was not just a machine, but a partner in survival. By 1944, with the Allied invasion of Normandy looming, the Thunderbolt was everywhere, dominating skies, supporting ground troops, and turning the tide of the air war. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not just about machines or battles won. It's about innovation, resilience, and the power of adaptation. When the Luftwaffe laughed at the P-47, they didn't realize they were witnessing the arrival of an unstoppable force, and when that force roared to life, the skies of Europe would never be the same. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into aviation history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more stories that bring the past to life.